The United Nations Refugee Agency says that 20,000 civilians have been forced to leave their homes in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo following a series of attacks by armed groups. The bulk of the violence in recent months has been focused on North Kivu province, where dozens of armed groups have been terrorizing communities for decades. The SABC's Chris Ochamringa has the story for us from Kinshasa.
The latest wave of displacement began last month in the Democratic Republic of Congo's eastern territory of Beni. Authorities say nearly 20,000 people have been forced to flee their homes following a rise in attacks by armed groups. The Congolese army has blamed the attacks on a rebel group known as the Allied Democratic Forces. It's an Islamist group that has its origins in neighboring Uganda. The UN Refugee Agency is calling for urgent measures to protect civilians in eastern DRC.
To the Congolese, we continue to ask that they increase their efforts to protect the population, to ensure that there's security so that they won't have to be fleeing almost all the time, carrying their baggages on their back. And then for the international community, is not to forget these people. It doesn't matter how frequently they are forced to flee. It's a new situation for that woman, for that man, for that old woman who lives and flees his home.
In May this year, the DRC president placed 2 conflict-prone regions under direct military rule in an attempt to end the violence against civilians. But the killings have continued in Ituri and North Kivu province. Officials say more than 300 people have been killed by armed groups since the beginning of the year. The UN says the illegal exploitation of minerals that are found in the east of the DRC has fueled conflict there for over 2 decades. The conflict has made it difficult for humanitarian agencies to support the displaced people. Chris Ochamringa, SABC News, Kinshasa.
Well, to help us unpack the humanitarian crisis in East DRC, we're now joined via Zoom by Nixon Katembo, who's a Channel Africa producer and Africa Affairs analyst. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, Chris. We seem to always be having conversations about militants, displaced people in Eastern DRC.
Indeed, thanks, Peter, for having me, and good evening to your viewers. This is really something that is very sad, that we have to be talking every day about the issues of the Eastern DRC without any tangible solution to the problem there, despite the presence of the UN peacekeeping forces, including the large chunk of the Congolese military deployed in the region. Having said that, you would recall that just in recent months, the Congolese government placed the region under a state of siege and brought their military governors, including military, but it seems not solving anything. I think for me, as a person who understands the region, the problem is fundamental within the state, and not within the state, but also as a regional problem as well. So unless this problem is understood in its context, of course, we will keep on talking about what is happening in the DRC and the atrocity committed against the civilians.
Is there anything different about this latest wave or escalation, or is it just different characters coming to the prominence and then others take over at different times?
No, I think we have to make it clear that it's a continuation of what has been happening. The idea is to cause the mass displacement of the region, to depopulate the region so that it can make way for different actors in occupying the region. So if you look at, for instance, where people are living in Beni, in places like Oicha, in places like Kamango, in places like Mombasa, you find that those villages, the occupants or the people who own lands there are chased from their land, and then eventually when they return, they are new occupants. And then one asks, who are these new occupants that are coming from there? And where are they coming from? And who is sending them? And not only that, who is arming them? No one talked about those issues, or no one even seems to be bothering to understand the nature of the problem in making sure that the civilian populations are protected. And this is where lies the problem, the continuation of the war is rather seems to be a way for some within government to enrich themselves, and also in the region for the Eastern DRC to continue as a source of minerals to flow to move out of the country and go to external markets, and that's the nature of the problem actually.
Is there any one group that is dominant in the region, or is this just a number of militant groups? We know that some have split into several different groups over time. What is the lay of the land in terms of who these characters are?
Well, the characters are they always say that's the ADF, and you do know, I have said several times that the ADF is almost non-existent. It has been weakened significantly since the first attack in 1996. And there is a tendency of, creating new rebel groups and then giving them a name of being ADF, because the ADF is the only one that has been significantly, pointed out as the one carrying atrocities. But if you look at the population of movements, for instance, where former Rwandan refugees were living in the Masisi and Walikale and the Ruchuru territory of the North Kivu, you have those populations moving towards the far north of the North Kivu province in Beni, and then in Ituri in places like Boga. And most of these are people who are being used actually to kill the real occupant of the land there. And then they take a characteristic of being ADF. But those are actually new formations of, new assailant against the civilians there. But the pretext is always the ADF being blamed for all the atrocities that are happening there. And you'd recall that ADF leaders have had some significant cooperation with some of the military rulers, military high-ranking officials within Kabila's government, the former president, including the General Mundos, and these are people who are cited in various UN reports. And then you have the part where the Rwandan military have been cited in various UN reports of arming some of the different rebel group and the faction in creating even a multitude of those rebel groups and continue causing mayhem in Eastern DRC, so of rebel groups as the ADF has been known. And in fact, if you ask the local population, they have also been pointing fingers at the United Nations that the United Nations somehow also has been part of the problem, because local populations through eyewitness accounts say that the UN also has been conspiring in arming some of these civilians as to justify the UN presence in the region, and therefore the UN mandate continue. But actually, that's the nature of the conflict.
So at the beginning of this conversation, you talked about the Congolese army and UN forces being present. Why is it that they cannot deal with this militant problem in the east of the DRC?
They cannot deal with the militant problems because it's a business for them. Let's make it plain and clear. I think in a layman's term, it's a business for them. There have to be justification for the UN presence there. That's one aspect. On the other hand of the Congolese army, you see, these are the Congo, as I know it, does not have a properly constituted army. And here I mean a national Republican army which serve the interest of the country, because you have to know that these are an agglomeration of different various rebel groups since 1998. I mean, in 1996, after the arrival of FDL, which was led by Laura Kabila, and the subsequent rebellion that have been sponsored by Rwanda and Uganda in the DRC, and the different discussions that happen. And you would see that all other rebel groups that were formed thereafter, they only claim to lay out arms and join the government forces was to retain their ranks within the rebellions. So therefore, they go into the government troops without necessarily undergoing necessary training that require for a Republican National Army. So in a nutshell, the Congo, on the other hand, has its problem with the institutional framework. And on the other hand, you have now this historical involvement of its neighbors, namely Rwanda and Uganda, taking advantage of the situation, and in fact also pushing the situation further into making sure that there is a mineral flow from that part of the country through their own benefit. You would recall that a stabilized Congo is not to the benefit of Rwanda, it's not benefit of Uganda, and many other players, including Burundi, whose rebel hideout is in Eastern DRC. Rwanda as well, you know, it's a rebel hideout in Eastern DRC, but also Rwanda as well, using former FDLR or FDLR as it is, as a pretext to have a continued presence in the DRC.
The civilians, sadly, that continue to be victims of all of these insurgencies, 20,000 have been displaced. Where do they go, and do they ever get back home?
Mostly, most of them have been now living in the periphery of the places that they once called home. Some are now found in different cities across the region. Some are in places like Bunia, some are in places like Beni in the city center, some are like in places like Butembo, some are in places like Goma, or anywhere major agglomeration within the region. And those who manage to escape even go to neighboring countries such as Uganda, and a significant number also sometimes go to Rwanda, and various countries across the region. So wherever you go, for instance, if you go to Tanzania, places like Kasulu in western Tanzania and province of Kigoma, you will find many Congolese there. If you go to places in Kenya, in refugee camps like Kakuma, you will find Congolese there. And this is the reason why how you find the people displaced in various ways. But I think there is a significant number of people who are still inside the country, who just move from one place to another without any assistance from whatsoever.
All right, my dear brother, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, as always, for your insightful analysis on the situation in the DRC. Merci beaucoup, mon ami. À bientôt.
Merci, à bientôt.